I'm Macky Trenor, and the day my grandfather was buried, my cousins made sure everyone knew I didn't belong there. They whispered loud enough for me to hear that I was just waiting for handouts, that I'd been living off the family name without earning a dime. They seated me in the back row like I was some distant acquaintance who'd wandered in off the street. But what they didn't know was that while they were counting money that wasn't theirs yet, Grandpa Vincent had been watching. And what he left behind wasn't just a business empire worth $40 million. It was a lesson they'd never forget. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The morning started like any other Tuesday, except it wasn't. My phone had been buzzing since 5 in the morning with calls I didn't want to answer. The funeral home, the lawyer's office, my cousin Derek trying to sound concerned when we both knew he was just fishing for information. I let them all go to voicemail while I sat in my small apartment kitchen staring at a cup of coffee that had gone cold an hour ago. 3 days had passed since Grandpa Vincent died in his sleep at 87. 3 days since the phone call started. Since the family suddenly remembered I existed, since everyone began asking questions about wills and inheritances and who was entitled to what. I'd been living in this one-bedroom place above Mrs. Chen's bakery for 2 years now, ever since I'd graduated college with a degree in business management that felt more like expensive toilet paper most days. While my cousins Derek, Patricia, and Amanda had moved into their parents' guest houses and started working cushy positions at Trenor Industries, I'd been bouncing between part-time jobs and trying to figure out what the hell I was supposed to do with my life. Grandpa Vincent had built Trenor Industries from nothing, started with a single hardware store in 1962, and turned it into a chain of 43 locations across 3 states. Construction supplies, tools, equipment rentals, everything a contractor or homeowner could need. By the time I was old enough to understand wealth meant, he was already the richest man in our small Pennsylvania town, and everyone treated him like royalty. Everyone except me. To me, he was just Grandpa, the guy who taught me how to change oil in his garage and let me help him inventory bolts and screws every Saturday morning when I was 8 years old. My phone rang again. Derek's name flashed across the screen, and this time I answered. "Finally," he said, not bothering with pleasantries. "Where the hell have you been? The funeral's in 3 hours, and Mom wants to know if you're actually coming or if you're going to blow this off like everything else." I rubbed my eyes. Derek was my Uncle Robert's son, 2 years older than me, and had been treating me like a burden since we were kids. He'd inherited his father's talent for making every conversation feel like a business transaction. "I'll be there," I said. "Good. And Macky, try to look presentable, okay? This isn't one of your college parties. People are going to be watching." The line went dead before I could respond. I set the phone down and walked to my closet, which was really just a corner of the room with a tension rod holding up my 5 shirts and 2 pairs of dress pants. I pulled out my only black suit, the one I'd bought for job interviews that never led anywhere. It was wrinkled and smelled faintly of mothballs, but it would have to do. An hour later, I was standing in front of Fuller & Son's funeral home, watching a parade of expensive cars pull into the parking lot. Black BMWs, Mercedes sedans, a few Audis, all of them driven by family members I hadn't seen since last Christmas. The building itself was one of those old Victorian houses converted into a business, all dark wood and stained glass windows that made everything feel heavy and formal. I straightened my tie and walked through the front doors into a lobby filled with flower arrangements that probably cost more than my monthly rent. The viewing room was packed. Grandpa Vincent lay in a mahogany casket at the front, surrounded by white lilies and red roses. He looked smaller than I remembered, more fragile, but peaceful. I'd visited him at the nursing home every Sunday for the past 6 months, watching him fade a little more each week, so this shouldn't have been a shock. But seeing him like this, so still and quiet, hit me harder than I'd expected. "Macky," Patricia's voice cut through my thoughts. She was walking toward me in a designer black dress that probably cost more than my car, her blonde hair pulled back in a perfect chignon. Patricia was Uncle Thomas's daughter, 32 years old, and had been running the marketing department at Trenor Industries for the past 5 years. She had that polished, corporate look that made her seem older and more important than she actually was. "Patricia," I said, accepting her brief hug, "I'm sorry for your loss." She pulled back and looked me up and down, her expression neutral but somehow critical. "Thank you. How are you holding up?" "I'm fine. It's been hard, but he lived a good life." "Yes, he did." She paused, glancing around the room. "Listen, I don't want to make this awkward, but we should probably talk about expectations for today." "Expectations?" "The family's been discussing things, and we just want to make sure everyone understands their place. This is going to be a very public event. The mayor's coming, half the city council, business leaders from all over the state. Grandpa was an important man, and we need to present a united front." I stared at her. "What exactly are you saying?" "I'm saying that maybe you should keep a low profile today. Let the people who actually worked with him, who built the business with him, be the ones who speak for the family." Before I could respond, Derek appeared at Patricia's side like he'd been summoned. He was wearing a three-piece suit that fit him perfectly, his dark hair slicked back with enough gel to survive a hurricane. Derek had always been the golden boy, the one everyone expected to take over the business someday. He had his grandfather's sharp jawline and his father's calculating eyes. "Macky," he said, extending his hand for a handshake that felt more like a business greeting than family condolences. "Glad you made it. Wouldn't miss it." "Of course not." His smile was thin. Patricia was just explaining how we're handling things today. She was explaining how I should make myself invisible. Derek's expression didn't change. "That's not what she said. We're just trying to be organized. There are going to be a lot of important people here, and we want to make sure the family presents well." "And I don't present well?" "You present fine, Macky. You just present differently than the rest of us." I looked around the room at my extended family, all of them dressed in expensive clothes, all of them looking like they belonged in a corporate boardroom or country club. Then I looked down at my wrinkled suit and scuffed shoes. They weren't wrong. I did present differently. "Where am I sitting?" I asked. Patricia and Derek exchanged a glance. "We've reserved the first 3 rows for immediate family and business partners," Patricia said. "You'll be in the 4th row with the extended family and close friends." Extended family? You know what I mean. I did know what she meant. I was Vincent Trenor's grandson, same as Derek and Patricia and Amanda, but I was also Robert Trenor's son. And Robert Trenor was the family disappointment, the youngest brother who'd never quite figured out how to make money the way his older siblings had. He died in a car accident when I was 12, leaving behind a mountain of debt and a reputation for drinking too much and working too little. In the family hierarchy, that made me damaged goods by association. 4th row it is, I said. The service was everything you'd expect for a man who'd built a business empire in a small town. The pastor talked about Vincent's generosity, his work ethic, his dedication to family and community. The mayor gave a speech about economic development and local leadership. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now, back to the story. Derek stood up and delivered a polished eulogy about legacy and vision and carrying on traditions. He talked about Grandpa Vincent like he was reading from a corporate mission statement, all buzzwords and empty phrases that sounded impressive but didn't mean anything. I sat in the 4th row and listened to person after person talk about a man they'd clearly admired but didn't really know. They talked about his business acumen and his charitable donations and his commitment to excellence. Nobody mentioned that he still changed his own oil until he was 83. Nobody talked about how he kept a candy dish on his desk specifically for kids who came to the store with their parents. Nobody said anything about the way he'd listen to your problems without trying to fix them, just nodding and letting you work through whatever was bothering you. When the service ended, we followed the hearse to Evergreen Cemetery for the burial. It was one of those crisp October days where the leaves were just starting to turn, orange and yellow mixed with green. The kind of day Grandpa Vincent had always said was perfect for working outside. The cemetery sat on a hill overlooking the town, with rows of headstones stretching down toward the valley where Trenor Industries had its headquarters. The burial was shorter, more intimate. Just family and close friends gathered around the grave while the pastor said a few final words. I stood toward the back of the group, watching Derek and Patricia and Amanda position themselves prominently near the front. Uncle Thomas had his arm around his wife Sarah. Uncle Robert's widow, my mother Janet, stood by herself near the middle of the group, looking small and tired. As they lowered the casket into the ground, I found myself thinking about the last conversation I'd had with Grandpa Vincent. It was 3 weeks ago, on a Sunday afternoon in his room at Sunset Manor. He'd been having a good day, alert and talkative, and we'd spent an hour talking about everything and nothing. He'd asked me about my job search, about my plans for the future, about whether I was happy. "You remind me of myself when I was your age," he'd said, which had surprised me because I'd never thought of myself as particularly ambitious or driven. "How's that?" "You're not in a hurry to be something you're not. Too many people these days are so worried about looking successful that they forget to actually become successful." I'd laughed. I don't think Derek would agree with that assessment. Grandpa Vincent had gotten a mischievous look in his eyes, the same expression he used to get when he was planning some kind of surprise. "Derek's a good boy, but he's been handed everything on a silver platter. He's never had to figure out who he is when nobody's watching. And I have? You've been figuring it out your whole life, Macky. That's going to serve you well someday." Now, standing beside his grave, I wondered what he'd meant by that. I'd been unemployed for 3 months, living in a studio apartment above a bakery, driving a 15-year-old Honda Civic that needed new brakes. I didn't feel like someone who was figuring anything out. I felt like someone who was barely keeping his head above water. After the burial, everyone gathered at the Riverside Country Club for a reception. The country club was exactly what you'd expect in a town like ours, all dark wood paneling and leather furniture, with oil paintings of long-dead members hanging on the walls. The main dining room had been reserved for the family, with round tables draped in white linens and centerpieces of white roses and baby's breath. I found my name at a table near the back of the room, seated with some distant cousins I barely knew and a few family friends who looked like they'd rather be anywhere else. Derek, Patricia, and Amanda were at the head table with their parents and spouses holding court like they were hosting a business dinner rather than mourning their grandfather. The conversation at my table was polite but distant. People asked how I was doing, what I was working on, whether I have any exciting plans coming up. I gave vague, non-committal answers and tried to focus on my salmon dinner, which was perfectly prepared and completely tasteless. Halfway through the meal, I excused myself to use the restroom. The hallway outside the dining room was quiet, lined with framed photographs of golf tournaments and charity events from decades past. I was heading back toward the dining room when I heard voices coming from a small conference room with the door slightly ajar. "The lawyer wants to do the reading tomorrow afternoon," Derek was saying, 2 o'clock at his office. "Have you talked to him about what to expect?" That was Uncle Thomas. "He's being professional about it, but he gave me some hints. The business goes to Dad and Uncle Robert's estate, obviously. Probably split 3 ways between the brothers, which means Mom gets Robert's share since he's gone." "What about the properties?" Patricia's voice. "The house, the cabin, probably divided up among the grandchildren. Amanda gets something, I get something, you get something." "And Macky?" Uncle Thomas again. There was a pause. "There might be a small bequest, maybe enough to pay off his student loans or cover rent for a few months. Grandpa always had a soft spot for him, but he wasn't stupid. He knew who actually contributed to the family." "It's probably for the best," Patricia said. "Macky's never shown any interest in the business anyway. This way he gets something, but not enough to cause problems." "Exactly. And let's be honest, Robert would have run the company into the ground if Grandpa had left him a significant share. At least this way we can keep things stable." I stood in the hallway, frozen. They were talking about Grandpa Vincent's will like it was a done deal, like they'd already read it and knew exactly what it said. They were discussing my inheritance like it was pocket change, something to keep me quiet and out of the way. "The important thing is maintaining continuity," Derek continued. We've got 43 stores, 215 employees, supplier relationships that go back decades. This isn't the time for experimentation or bringing in people who don't understand the business. Agreed, Uncle Thomas said. Vincent built something special, and it's our responsibility to protect it. I heard chair legs scraping against the floor and quickly moved away from the door, walking back toward the dining room like I hadn't heard anything. But my mind was racing. They were so confident, so certain that they knew what Grandpa Vincent had planned. They'd already divided up his life's work among themselves, already decided that I didn't deserve a meaningful part of it. The rest of the reception passed in a blur. I made polite conversation, accepted condolences from people I barely knew, and watched my cousins work the room like they were campaigning for office. Derek gave an impromptu speech about carrying on his grandfather's legacy. Patricia talked to a reporter from the local newspaper about the family's commitment to the community. Amanda, who was only 28 and had been working in the accounting department for less than 2 years, somehow found herself discussing expansion plans with a group of local business owners. I left early, claiming I had a headache. Nobody seemed surprised or disappointed to see me go. That night, I sat in my apartment and tried to process everything that had happened. The funeral had been a reminder of how different I was from the rest of my family, how I'd never quite fit into their world of business suits and country clubs and networking events. The conversation I'd overheard at the reception had been a confirmation of what I'd always suspected, that they saw me as a charity case, someone to be managed and contained rather than included. I pulled out my laptop and started researching Vincent Trenor online, reading articles about his business success and philanthropic activities. Most of the stories were the same, talking about his rise from a single hardware store to a regional empire, his reputation for fair dealing and community involvement. There were quotes from Derek and Uncle Thomas in several articles, positioning themselves as the natural successors to his business. My name didn't appear anywhere. One article from the local business journal caught my attention. It was from 6 months ago, an interview with Grandpa Vincent about succession planning and the future of family businesses. The reporter had asked him about his plans for Trenor Industries after his death. Success isn't about genetics, he'd said. It's about character. You can teach someone to read financial statements or negotiate with suppliers, but you can't teach them to care about people or understand what hard work actually means. When I'm gone, I want the business to go to someone who understands that. The reporter had pressed him about whether that meant one of his sons or grandchildren would take over. It means the business will go to the person who's earned it, Grandpa Vincent had replied, not the person who expects it. I read that quote 3 times, trying to figure out what it meant. Was he talking about Derek, who'd been working at the company for 8 years and was clearly being groomed for leadership? Was he talking about Uncle Thomas, who'd been running the operations side of the business for the past decade? Or was he saying something else entirely? My phone buzzed with a text message from my mother.
"How are you holding up, honey? I know today was hard." I called her back. Mom had left the reception early too, claiming she was tired, but I suspected she'd felt as out of place as I had. "I'm okay," I told her. "It was a nice service." "Your grandfather would have hated all that formality," she said. "He always preferred small gatherings." "Mom, can I ask you something? Did Dad ever talk about Grandpa Vincent's plans for the business? I mean, before he died?" There was a long pause. "Why do you ask?" "Just curious. Derek and Patricia seem pretty confident about what's going to happen tomorrow. Your father always said that Vincent was full of surprises. He used to joke that his dad kept his cards so close to his chest that he probably didn't even know what hand he was holding. But did he ever say anything specific? Macky, your grandfather loved all of his grandchildren, but he also had very strong opinions about character and work ethic. He believed that wealth should be earned, not inherited, which suggests I'm not getting anything meaningful, which suggests that he made his decisions based on more than just bloodlines." After we hung up, I sat in the dark for a long time, thinking about everything that had happened since Grandpa Vincent died. The phone calls from family members who normally ignored me, the careful seating arrangements at the funeral, the conversation I'd overheard about small bequests and keeping me out of the way, The confident assumption that Derek and the others already knew what the will contained. Something didn't feel right. Grandpa Vincent had been a lot of things, but predictable wasn't one of them. He'd built his business by taking calculated risks, by seeing opportunities that other people missed. He'd never been the type to simply follow conventional wisdom or do what people expected him to do. I thought about all those Saturday mornings in his garage, learning to change oil and replace brake pads. I thought about the candy dish on his desk and the way he'd listen without trying to fix your problems. I thought about his comment that I reminded him of himself when he was young, and his cryptic statement about figuring out who you are when nobody's watching. Maybe Derek and Patricia and Uncle Thomas were right. Maybe I was going to walk into that lawyer's office tomorrow and receive just enough money to pay off my student loans, a polite dismissal wrapped in legal language. Maybe they'd already seen the will and knew exactly what to expect. But maybe, just maybe, they were in for a surprise. The next morning arrived with the kind of gray drizzle that makes everything look washed out and depressing. I'd barely slept, spending most of the night staring at the ceiling and replaying the conversation I'd overheard at the country club. By 6 a.m., I gave up on sleep entirely and made coffee that tasted like burnt water. My phone had 3 missed calls from Derek, all from before 7 in the morning. When I called him back, he answered on the first ring. "Jesus, Macky, where have you been? I've been trying to reach you for an hour." I was sleeping. Some people do that at night. Listen, there's been a change of plans. The will reading got moved up to 10 this morning instead of 2 this afternoon. Something about the lawyer's scheduling conflict. I glanced at the clock on my microwave. It was 7:15. That's less than 3 hours' notice. I know. Can you make it or not? I'll be there. Good. And Macky, this is going to be emotional for everyone. Let's try to keep things dignified, okay? I hung up without responding. Derek's version of dignified usually meant sitting quietly while other people made decisions about your life. I showered, put on the same black suit I'd worn to the funeral, and drove across town to the offices of Hartwell, Morrison & Associates. The law firm occupied the top 2 floors of the tallest building in downtown, which wasn't saying much in a town of 35,000 people, but it was impressive enough. The lobby had marble floors and expensive-looking artwork that probably cost more than my annual income. The receptionist, a woman in her 50s with silver hair and a professional smile, directed me to the conference room on the 12th floor. When the elevator doors opened, I could hear voices coming from down the hallway. My entire extended family was already there, gathered in clusters like they were at a cocktail party rather than a legal proceeding. Uncle Thomas stood near the windows overlooking Main Street, talking quietly with his wife Sarah. Derek and Patricia were huddled together near the coffee station, both of them checking their phones every few seconds. Amanda sat at the conference table, looking nervous and young in a navy blue dress that was probably more expensive than my car payment. My mother was there too, sitting by herself in a chair against the wall, looking small and uncomfortable. She gave me a weak smile when I walked in, and I went over to sit beside her. "How are you holding up?" I asked. "About as well as can be expected," she said. "This whole thing feels surreal." Before I could respond, the conference room door opened and Richard Hartwell walked in. He was in his 60s, tall and thin, with white hair and the kind of presence that made you sit up straighter automatically. He'd been Grandpa Vincent's lawyer for 30 years, handling everything from business contracts to personal legal matters. "Good morning, everyone," he said, setting a thick manila folder on the table. "I know this has been moved up from our original time, so I appreciate everyone adjusting their schedules." He took a seat at the head of the conference table and gestured for the rest of us to join him. There was a brief moment of musical chairs as everyone found their places. Derek and Uncle Thomas positioned themselves prominently at Hartwell's right side. Patricia and Amanda sat across from them. My mother and I ended up at the far end of the table, which seemed appropriate given our status in the family hierarchy. Before we begin, I want to explain how this process works. I'm going to read Vincent's will in its entirety, exactly as he wrote it. There may be parts that surprise some of you, and there will be time for questions at the end. I ask that you hold your comments until I've finished reading the complete document. He opened the manila folder and pulled out a document that looked like it was at least 20 pages long. Derek leaned forward slightly, his expression confident and expectant. Uncle Thomas nodded approvingly, like he was already mentally dividing up assets. The last will and testament of Vincent Robert Trenor, Hartwell began, dated March 15th of this year. That caught my attention. March was only 7 months ago, which meant Grandpa Vincent had updated his will relatively recently. I glanced around the table and noticed that Derek and Uncle Thomas looked slightly less confident than they had a moment earlier. Hartwell cleared his throat and continued. I, Vincent Robert Trenor, being of sound mind and body, do hereby make this my final will and testament, revoking all previous wills and codicils. The first several pages covered the standard legal language, the appointment of Hartwell as executor, instructions for funeral arrangements, and a series of small bequests to longtime employees and local charities. Grandpa Vincent left $50,000 to the Children's Hospital, $25,000 to the Volunteer Fire Department, and smaller amounts to various community organizations. Then came the personal bequests to family members. Uncle Thomas received the cabin on Lake Wallenpack, which was worth probably $200,000. His wife Sarah got Grandma Helen's jewelry collection. Derek was left the vintage Mustang that Grandpa Vincent had restored in his garage, along with his collection of antique tools. Patricia received the contents of his wine cellar and his collection of first edition books. Amanda got his golf clubs and a trust fund of $75,000 for her children's education. Various other cousins and family friends received smaller items and monetary gifts. My mother was left the house on Elm Street where Grandpa Vincent had lived for 40 years, along with all its contents.
It was a generous gift, probably worth $300,000, and I could see tears forming in her eyes as Hartwell read that section. Then Hartwell reached my name. To my grandson Macky Trenor, he read, I leave my fishing equipment, my collection of vinyl records, and my personal library, along with a monetary bequest of $10,000. I felt my stomach drop. $10,000. It was more than I'd expected based on the conversation I'd overheard, but it was still a fraction of what everyone else had received. Derek tried to hide his smirk behind his hand. Patricia looked relieved. Uncle Thomas nodded like this confirmed what he'd expected all along. But Hartwell wasn't finished reading. He turned to the next page and paused, looking around the table with an expression I couldn't quite read. Now we come to the disposition of Trenor Industries and all related business assets, he said. This is where Vincent's will becomes more detailed and specific. Derek sat up straighter. Uncle Thomas leaned forward. The room got very quiet. I have spent considerable time thinking about the future of the business I built over the past 60 years, Hartwell read. Trenor Industries represents not just my life's work, but the livelihoods of more than 200 employees and their families. The decision of who should control this company after my death is not one I have made lightly. He paused again, and I could hear someone's watch ticking in the silence. I have watched my sons and grandchildren carefully over the years. I have observed their work ethic, their character, their treatment of others, and their understanding of what it means to build something rather than simply inherit it. Derek's smirk was gone now. Patricia looked confused. Uncle Thomas had gone very still. Derek has worked at Trenor Industries for 8 years, Hartwell continued reading. He is intelligent, ambitious, and has shown aptitude for sales and customer relations. However, he has also demonstrated a sense of entitlement and a tendency to view employees as disposable resources rather than valuable team members. Derek's face had gone pale. He started to say something, but Hartwell held up a hand. Patricia has contributed meaningfully to our marketing efforts and has good instincts for brand management. However, she has shown little interest in the operational side of the business and has made comments suggesting she views the company primarily as a source of personal wealth rather than a responsibility to the community. Patricia's mouth was hanging open slightly. She looked like she'd been slapped. Thomas has been a loyal and hardworking son who has contributed significantly to the company's growth.
However, his approach to management has become increasingly focused on cost-cutting and efficiency at the expense of employee welfare and community engagement. Uncle Thomas was gripping the edge of the table so hard his knuckles had turned white. Amanda is young and shows promise, but lacks the experience and depth of understanding necessary to lead a complex organization. Hartwell turned to the next page. Therefore, after careful consideration and extensive observation, I hereby bequeath Trenor Industries in its entirety, including all retail locations, warehouse facilities, equipment, inventory, accounts, and goodwill, to my grandson Macky Trenor. The silence that followed was so complete I could hear the air conditioning humming in the walls. Derek looked like he'd been hit by a truck. Patricia's face had gone from pale to bright red. Uncle Thomas was staring at Hartwell like he'd started speaking a foreign language. Furthermore, Hartwell continued, his voice steady and professional, I leave to Macky Trenor all business bank accounts, investment portfolios, and real estate holdings associated with Trenor Industries, with a current estimated value of $42 million. Someone made a noise that might have been a gasp or a choke. I couldn't tell because my ears were ringing and I felt like I might pass out. In addition, I am establishing a transition fund of $5 million to ensure smooth leadership change and to provide Macky with the resources necessary to learn and grow into his new responsibilities. Derek shot to his feet. This is insane, he said, his voice cracking slightly. There's no way Grandpa would do this. Macky doesn't know anything about running a business. He's been unemployed for months. Hartwell looked at him calmly. I'm not finished reading, Derek. Please sit down. Derek remained standing, but he didn't say anything else. I know this decision will surprise some family members, Hartwell continued. I want to explain my reasoning clearly so there can be no misunderstanding. He turned to another page. Macky is the only member of the family who has visited me regularly at Sunset Manor without being asked or expected to do so. He has shown genuine interest in my stories about building the business, not because he wanted something from me, but because he cared about me as a person. I felt my mother's hand squeeze my arm. More importantly, Macky has demonstrated the character traits I believe are essential for business leadership. He is hardworking, honest, and treats all people with respect regardless of their social or economic status. He understands the value of a dollar because he has had to earn every one. He knows what it means to struggle, which will make him a better employer and leader. Patricia found her voice. Uncle Vincent, with all due respect, character doesn't qualify someone to run a $40 million company. There are legal responsibilities, financial complexities, operational challenges that require experience and education. Hartwell held up the will. Vincent anticipated that concern, he said. Let me continue. I am aware that Macky lacks formal business experience. Therefore, I am requiring that he complete a one-year management training program before assuming full control of the company. During this period, Thomas will continue as interim president, Derek will remain in his current sales position, and Patricia will continue overseeing marketing. All family members currently employed by Trenor Industries will retain their positions and salaries during this transition period. Uncle Thomas finally spoke up. What if he fails the training program? What if he proves he can't handle the responsibility? Hartwell turned to the next page. Vincent addressed that as well. If Macky chooses not to accept this inheritance, or if he fails to complete the training program successfully, then Trenor Industries will be sold, and the proceeds will be donated to charity. No other family member will inherit the business under any circumstances. The room erupted. Derek started shouting about legal challenges and family obligations. Patricia was demanding to know which charities would benefit from the sale. Uncle Thomas was asking about severance packages and pension obligations. Amanda looked like she was going to cry. Through it all, Hartwell sat calmly at the head of the table, waiting for the noise to die down. When it finally did, he continued reading. I want to be clear about my expectations for Macky, he read. This inheritance comes with significant responsibilities. He will be accountable for the livelihoods of more than 200 employees. He will need to maintain the company's reputation for quality and service, and he will be expected to continue our tradition of community involvement and charitable giving. He looked directly at me. Vincent also included a personal message for you, Macky. I know, not trusting my voice to work. My dear grandson, Hartwell read, I know this will come as a shock to you and to the rest of the family. I also know that some people will question whether you are capable of handling this responsibility. I want you to know that I have complete confidence in your ability to learn and grow into this role. My eyes are starting to blur with tears. You remind me of myself when I was young. Not because we share the same business instincts or financial acumen, but because we share the same values. You understand that success is not about accumulating wealth for its own sake, but about building something meaningful that serves others. Hartwell paused, looking around the room. The training program has already been arranged. You will spend 3 months learning operations and logistics, 3 months in finance and accounting, 3 months in sales and marketing, and 3 months in strategic planning and leadership. You will be mentored by experienced managers who are not family members to ensure objectivity and thorough preparation. He turned to the final page.
I know this decision will cause tension within the family. I hope that over time, everyone will understand that I made this choice not to punish anyone, but to ensure that Trenor Industries continues to thrive and serve our community for generations to come. Hartwell set the will down and looked around the table. That concludes the reading of Vincent Trenor's last will and testament. The document has been properly witnessed and notarized, and I can assure you that Vincent was of completely sound mind when he signed it 7 months ago. Derek was the first to break the silence. "We're going to contest this," he said, his voice tight with anger. "There's no way this will hold up in court. Undue influence, lack of capacity, coercion, whatever it takes." Hartwell's expression didn't change. "That is your right, Derek. However, I should mention that Vincent anticipated potential legal challenges. He underwent a complete psychological evaluation 2 days before signing this will, specifically to establish his mental competency. He also had the document reviewed by 2 independent attorneys to ensure it would withstand any contests." Patricia leaned forward. "What about family loyalty? What about the people who actually worked to build this company? Derek has given 8 years of his life to Trenor Industries. I've been there for 5 years. We've earned the right to inherit what our grandfather built." "Vincent's will explicitly addresses that concern," Hartwell replied. "He acknowledged the contributions of all family members and expressed his appreciation for their work. However, he also made it clear that he viewed the business as a responsibility rather than an entitlement." Uncle Thomas had been quiet throughout most of the exchange, but now he spoke up. "Macky, you need to understand what you're taking on here. This isn't just about money or ownership. You'll be responsible for payroll every 2 weeks, for maintaining vendor relationships, for dealing with regulatory compliance, for making decisions that affect hundreds of families. Are you prepared for that kind of pressure?" I looked around the table at faces that ranged from angry to confused to hurt. These were people I'd grown up with, people who'd known me since I was a child. They were looking at me like I was a stranger, or worse, like I was a threat. "I don't know," I said finally. "I honestly don't know if I'm prepared for any of this. Yesterday, I was worried about making rent, and today, I'm apparently inheriting a $40 million company? It's overwhelming." Derek snorted. "At least you're honest about being unqualified. But," I continued, "I know that Grandpa Vincent didn't make this decision lightly. He was the smartest businessman I've ever known, and if he thought I could learn to do this, then maybe I can." "And if you can't?" Patricia asked. "What happens to all of us then?" "Then I'll fail the training program, and the company gets sold to charity, just like the will says. But I'm not planning to fail." The meeting broke up shortly after that, with various family members making vague threats about legal action and accusations of favoritism. Derek stormed out without saying goodbye. Patricia followed him, talking rapidly on her phone to someone about lawyers and probate court. Uncle Thomas left with his wife, shaking his head and muttering about irresponsible decisions. My mother and I were among the last to leave. As we waited for the elevator, she put her arm around my shoulders.
"How are you feeling?" she asked. "Like I just got hit by a freight train full of money." She laughed, which was the first genuinely happy sound I'd heard all day. Your grandfather would have loved that description. In the elevator down to the lobby, I tried to process what had just happened. 12 hours ago, I'd been the family disappointment, the unemployed nephew living in a studio apartment above a bakery. Now I was apparently the heir to a business empire, assuming I could prove myself worthy of it. The magnitude of the responsibility was terrifying. 200 employees depending on me for their livelihoods. Millions of dollars in assets and inventory. Relationships with suppliers and customers that had been built over decades. The possibility of spectacular failure that would result in everything being sold off to charity. But underneath the fear was something else. For the first time in years, I felt like someone believed in me. Grandpa Vincent had seen something in me that I hadn't even seen in myself. He'd looked past my unemployment and my cheap apartment and my lack of business experience, and he'd decided I was worth betting $42 million on. That afternoon, I drove to Sunset Manor to visit Grandpa Vincent's old room. The staff had already cleared out his belongings, but I wanted to see the space where we'd had our last conversation. The room was small and clean, with a single bed and a window that looked out over the parking lot. It didn't look like the kind of place where life-changing decisions were made, but I suppose that most important moments happened in ordinary settings. I sat in the chair where I'd spent Sunday afternoons for the past 6 months, listening to stories about the early days of Trenor Industries. Grandpa Vincent had told me about the first store he'd opened, about the challenges of competing with national chains, about the satisfaction of providing jobs for people in the community. At the time, I thought he was just reminiscing. Now I wondered if he'd been preparing me for something. My phone rang. The caller ID showed Derek's name, and I debated whether to answer. Finally, curiosity won out. "Macky," he said, his voice calmer than it had been at the lawyer's office. "We need to talk." "I'm listening." "Not on the phone. Can you meet me somewhere? Maybe the diner on 5th Street. "When?" "Now, if you can. This is important." 20 minutes later, I was sitting across from Derek in a booth at Mel's Diner, a 24-hour place that had been serving coffee and pie to truckers and insomniacs since the 1960s. Derek looked exhausted, like he'd aged 5 years since the morning. "I've been thinking about what happened today," he said, "and I owe you an apology." That surprised me. Derek wasn't known for apologizing. "You don't owe me anything." "Yeah, I do. I've been treating you like you were invisible for years, and that wasn't fair. You're family, and I should have acted like it." I waited for the catch, because there was always a catch with Derek. "But I need you to understand something," he continued. "I've built my entire career around the assumption that I would eventually take over Trenor Industries. I've made decisions about my life, my family, my future based on that expectation. And now I find out that not only am I not going to inherit the business, but it's going to someone who's never even worked there. I understand why you're upset. Do you? Because from where I'm sitting, it feels like 8 years of my life just got flushed down the toilet." Derek leaned back in the booth, looking defeated. "I'm not saying Grandpa was wrong about your character. You're a good guy, Macky. You always have been. But character doesn't teach you how to read a profit and loss statement, or negotiate with suppliers, or deal with employment law. That's what the training program is for."
1 year of training to learn what I've been doing for 8 years? What Patricia and Dad have been doing even longer than that? I took a sip of my coffee, which was strong enough to wake the dead. "Derek, I didn't ask for this. I'm just as surprised as you are." "I know you didn't ask for it. That's part of what makes this so frustrating. If you'd been scheming and manipulating to get the inheritance, at least I could be angry at you personally. But you were just being yourself, and apparently that was enough to convince Grandpa that you deserved his life's work more than his own sons and grandchildren." We sat in silence for a while, both of us lost in our own thoughts. The diner was nearly empty, except for a trucker reading a newspaper at the counter and a young couple sharing a piece of chocolate cake. "What are you going to do?" Derek asked finally. "I'm going to try to learn the business. I'm going to do the training program and hope I don't screw everything up." "And if you do screw it up?" If you decide it's too much responsibility or too much pressure, then the company gets sold and everyone loses their jobs anyway. Derek nodded slowly. So we're all stuck with you whether we like it or not. Pretty much. He laughed, but there wasn't much humor in it. Grandpa really knew how to back people into a corner, didn't he? It's looking that way. Derek finished his coffee and signaled the waitress for the check. I have a proposal for you. I'm listening. Give me a chance to prove that I should be running this company instead of you. Let me oversee your training. Let me show you what I know and what I can do. If at the end of the year you still think you're the right person for the job, I'll support you. But if you realize that you're in over your head, step aside and let me buy the company from you. The will doesn't work that way. If I step aside, the company gets sold to charity. We'll find a way around that. Lawyers can be creative when there's enough money involved. I studied Derek's face, trying to figure out what he was really asking for. You want me to compete with you for control of Grandpa Vincent's company? I want both of us to prove we deserve it. Let the best man win. There was something appealing about the idea, but it also felt like a betrayal of Grandpa Vincent's wishes. He'd specifically chosen me over Derek and the others. Did I have the right to second-guess that decision? I need to think about it, I said. Fair enough. But Macky, don't take too long to decide. There are a lot of people whose futures depend on how this plays out. After Derek left, I sat in the diner for another hour, drinking bad coffee and trying to figure out what I'd gotten myself into. The weight of expectation felt heavier than the weight of money. $42 million was an abstract concept, but 200 employees with families and mortgages and bills to pay was very real. I thought about the conversation I'd overheard at the country club, about Derek and Patricia discussing my expected inheritance like it was pocket change. I thought about the way they'd positioned themselves at the funeral and the will reading, confident in their assumptions about how things would work out. I thought about Uncle Thomas's warnings about the pressure and responsibility of running a company. But I also thought about Grandpa Vincent's words, about his belief that I reminded him of himself when he was young, about his conviction that success wasn't about genetics or expectations, but about character and work ethic, about his faith that I could learn to handle the responsibility he was giving me. By the time I left the diner, I'd made my decision. I was going to do the training program. I was going to learn everything I could about running Trenor Industries, and I was going to prove that Grandpa Vincent's faith in me wasn't misplaced, whether Derek and the rest of the family liked it or not. 6 months into my training program, everything changed again. I was sitting in the operations office at 7 in the morning, reviewing inventory reports with Susan Martinez, our warehouse manager, when Derek burst through the door with a manila envelope in his hand and a look of triumph on his face. "Meeting, now, conference room," he said, not bothering with pleasantries. "Uncle Thomas, Patricia, you, me, 5 minutes." Susan raised an eyebrow but didn't comment. She'd been with Trenor Industries for 15 years and had seen plenty of family drama play out over the years. I followed Derek down the hallway, wondering what crisis had erupted this time. The conference room was already occupied when we arrived. Uncle Thomas sat at the head of the table with a stack of papers in front of him. Patricia was pacing by the windows, her heels clicking against the tile floor. A man I didn't recognize sat in the corner, wearing an expensive suit and the kind of confident expression that usually meant trouble. "Macky," Uncle Thomas said, gesturing to a chair. "Sit down. We need to discuss something important." Derek took the seat across from me and slid the manila envelope across the table. "Open it." Inside were photographs, black and white, taken with a telephoto lens, showing me entering and leaving various locations around town. The bakery where I lived, the diner where I ate lunch most days, the library where I'd been spending evenings studying business management books. But most of the photos showed me at Riverside Apartments, a complex on the east side of town. "Care to explain what you've been doing there 3 nights a week for the past 2 months?" Derek asked. I looked at the photos more carefully. They showed me walking into Building C, sometimes carrying a toolbox, sometimes just empty-handed. The timestamps indicated the pictures had been taken over several weeks. "I've been helping Mrs. Rodriguez," I said. "She's having trouble with her plumbing and can't afford to hire someone." Patricia stopped pacing. "Mrs. Rodriguez?" "Elena Rodriguez. She works part-time at the grocery store and has 3 kids. Her bathroom sink's been leaking for months and her landlord won't fix it." The man in the expensive suit leaned forward. "Mr. Trenor, I'm James Kellerman from Kellerman Investigations. Your family hired me to conduct a background check and monitor your activities during the training period." "You've been having me followed?" Derek smiled, but it wasn't friendly. "We needed to know what kind of person we're dealing with. What we found is very interesting." Uncle Thomas opened the folder in front of him. "According to Mr. Kellerman's report, you've been visiting Riverside Apartments regularly, often late at night."
You've also been seen at the unemployment office, the food bank, and several other locations that raise questions about your financial stability and judgment. "I volunteer at the food bank on Saturdays," I said. "I have for 3 years." "And the unemployment office?" "I was helping a guy named Mike Patterson file his paperwork. He got laid off from the construction company and couldn't figure out the online application." Patricia resumed her pacing. "That's very noble, Macky, but it also demonstrates a pattern of behavior that concerns us." "What pattern?" Derek pulled out another set of photos. "These showed me at various locations around town, always interacting with people who looked like they were struggling financially. Outside the WIC office, talking to a young mother with 2 small children. At the community center, helping an elderly man fill out forms. At the gas station, handing cash to someone whose card had been declined." "You've been giving away money," Derek said. "Money you don't have to people you barely know." "I've been helping people who needed help." "With what funds?" Uncle Thomas asked. "According to our financial review, you've been living paycheck to paycheck for years. Where did you get the money to play philanthropist?" I realized where this was going. "The $10,000 from Grandpa Vincent's will." "Exactly. You received a modest inheritance, and instead of investing it or saving it or using it to improve your own situation, you've been handing it out to strangers." Patricia sat down across from me. "Macky, we understand that you want to help people. It's admirable. But it also shows a fundamental lack of financial judgment that concerns us deeply." "What pattern?" Derek pulled out another set of photos. "These showed me at various locations around town, always interacting with people who looked like they were struggling financially. Outside the WIC office, talking to a young mother with 2 small children. At the community center, helping an elderly man fill out forms. At the gas station, handing cash to someone whose card had been declined." "You've been giving away money," Derek said. "Money you don't have to people you barely know." "I've been helping people who needed help." "With what funds?" Uncle Thomas asked. "According to our financial review, you've been living paycheck to paycheck for years. Where did you get the money to play philanthropist?" I realized where this was going. "The $10,000 from Grandpa Vincent's will." "Exactly. You received a modest inheritance, and instead of investing it or saving it or using it to improve your own situation, you've been handing it out to strangers." Patricia sat down across from me. "Macky, we understand that you want to help people. It's admirable. But it also shows a fundamental lack of financial judgment that concerns us deeply." The investigator cleared his throat. "There's more. Mr. Trenor has also been meeting regularly with workers from various Trenor Industries locations. Unofficial meetings, often at bars or restaurants, always off company property." Derek's smile widened. "Tell us about those meetings, Macky." I felt a knot forming in my stomach. "I've been talking to employees, getting their perspective on how the company operates, what problems they see, what improvements they think we could make." "Without authorization from management," Uncle Thomas said. "Without going through proper channels or following company protocols. I was learning about the business from the people who actually do the work." "You were undermining the chain of command," Patricia said. "You were encouraging employees to bypass their supervisors and bring their complaints directly to you." Derek leaned back in his chair, looking satisfied.
Add it all up, and we have a picture of someone who's financially irresponsible, operationally naive, and completely unsuited for business leadership. The investigator pulled out a thick report. I've documented 47 separate incidents of questionable judgment over the past 6 months. Financial decisions that demonstrate poor impulse control, operational decisions that show disregard for established procedures, and interpersonal decisions that suggest Mr. Trenor prioritizes popularity over profitability. Uncle Thomas closed his folder. Macky, we think it's time to be realistic about this situation. You're a good person with good intentions, but you're not cut out to run a business. The training program was supposed to prepare you for leadership, but instead it's revealed fundamental character flaws that make you unsuitable for the responsibility. Character flaws? Patricia nodded. You're too generous, too trusting, too willing to put other people's needs ahead of business interests. Those might be admirable personal qualities, but they're dangerous in a CEO. Derek stood up and walked to the window. We have a proposal. Resign from the training program voluntarily. Admit that you're in over your head and step aside gracefully. In exchange, we'll arrange for you to receive a generous severance package, enough to live comfortably for several years while you figure out what you really want to do with your life. And if I refuse? Then we present this evidence to the board of directors and request that you be removed from the program for cause, Uncle Thomas said. Either way, you're not going to inherit Trenor Industries, but you can choose whether to leave with dignity or be forced out in disgrace. I looked around the room at faces that ranged from sympathetic to smug. These people had spent 6 months watching me, documenting my actions, building a case against me. They'd hired a private investigator to follow me around town like I was a criminal. They'd taken photos of me helping people and turned them into evidence of poor judgment. How long do I have to decide? 24 hours, Derek said. We're calling a board meeting for tomorrow afternoon. You can either announce your resignation or face a vote of no confidence. I stood up and walked toward the door, then stopped and turned back. Can I ask you something? Do any of you actually care about the employees of this company, or do you just see them as line items on a spreadsheet? Patricia looked confused. What do you mean? Mrs. Rodriguez works 30 hours a week at minimum wage because that's all her health allows. She's been dealing with a leaking sink for months because she can't afford a plumber and her landlord won't help. I spent $200 on parts and 3 evenings fixing it. You see that as poor financial judgment. I see it as basic human decency. Derek shook his head. That's exactly the problem, Macky. You can't run a business based on feelings and charity cases. Mike Patterson worked for Hendricks Construction for 12 years before they laid him off. He couldn't figure out how to file for unemployment because he'd never done it before, and the online system was confusing. I spent 2 hours helping him navigate the process. You see that as undermining established procedures. I see it as helping a good man who got screwed over by circumstance. Uncle Thomas sighed. Macky, we understand that you want to help people, but you can't save everyone, and trying to do so will destroy the company. And what about the employee meetings? You call them unauthorized and inappropriate, but I learned more about this business in those conversations than I did in 3 months of management presentations. The warehouse guys know exactly why we're losing efficiency. The sales team has ideas for improving customer relationships. The administrative staff sees problems that never make it up the chain of command. Because there are proper channels for that kind of feedback, Patricia said. There are procedures and protocols that exist for good reasons. The procedures and protocols aren't working. Half the problems I heard about in those meetings have been going on for years, and management either doesn't know about them or doesn't care. I walked back to the table and picked up the investigator's report. This document is 300 pages of evidence that I care more about people than profit margins. You're right. I spent the $10,000 helping people instead of investing it. I talked to employees instead of talking to managers. I tried to understand the human side of the business instead of just the financial side. Derek was starting to look less confident. And that's exactly why you're not qualified to run this company. Or maybe that's exactly why Grandpa Vincent chose me. The room went quiet. I could hear the air conditioning humming and traffic passing by outside the windows. Grandpa Vincent built this company by treating people fairly and caring about the community. He understood that business success depends on employee loyalty and customer trust, not just quarterly profits. You've spent 6 months proving that I don't think like a traditional businessman, but maybe that's the point. I set the report back on the table. I'll give you my answer tomorrow, but I want you to think about something. If you force me out and take control of the company, what are you going to do differently? Are you going to pay people more? Are you going to invest in the community? Are you going to prioritize employee welfare over cost-cutting? None of them answered. That's what I thought. I left the conference room and drove straight to Evergreen Cemetery. Grandpa Vincent's grave was still marked with a temporary placard while they waited for the permanent headstone to be finished. I sat on the grass beside it and tried to figure out what he would have wanted me to do. The evidence against me was compelling, at least from a traditional business perspective. I had been financially irresponsible by their standards. I had bypassed proper channels and ignored established procedures. I had prioritized helping people over protecting my own interests. But I'd also learned things about Trenor Industries that Derek, Patricia, and Uncle Thomas didn't know. I'd discovered inefficiencies that were costing the company thousands of dollars. I'd identified employee concerns that were affecting productivity and morale. I'd built relationships with workers who were eager to contribute ideas and solutions if anyone would listen to them. More importantly, I'd proven to myself that I could learn. 6 months ago, I couldn't read a balance sheet or understand inventory management or negotiate with suppliers. Now I could do all of those things competently, if not expertly. The training program was working, even if my family didn't approve of my methods. That evening, I called Richard Hartwell and asked if I could see him. We met at his office after hours, and I explained what had happened at the meeting. "They have a legal right to request your removal from the program," he said after I'd finished. "The will gives the board of directors oversight authority during the training period." What would Grandpa Vincent have wanted me to do? Hartwell smiled. "Vincent once told me that the measure of a man isn't whether he falls down, but whether he gets back up and keeps fighting for what he believes in." So I should fight? I think you should do whatever feels right to you. But I'll tell you this. Vincent spent 60 years building a company culture based on respect for employees and commitment to the community. If that culture dies with him, then his life's work dies too, regardless of who inherits the business. The next morning, I walked into the conference room where the board of directors was waiting. Derek, Patricia, Uncle Thomas, and 3 outside directors who'd known Grandpa Vincent for decades. The investigator was there too, with his report and his photographs and his evidence of my unsuitability for leadership. "Gentlemen, ladies," I said, taking my seat at the table, "I've made my decision." Derek leaned forward expectantly. Patricia had her phone ready, probably to call her lawyer. "I'm not resigning." The silence that followed was brief but intense. "Furthermore," I continued, "I'd like to present some information of my own." I pulled out a folder I'd prepared the night before. Over the past 6 months, I've identified 17 operational inefficiencies that are costing this company approximately $400,000 annually. I've documented employee suggestions that could improve productivity by an estimated 15%. And I've developed relationships with our workforce that have given me insights into problems that management has been ignoring for years. One of the outside directors, Chen, looked interested. "What kind of problems?" "Equipment failures that could be prevented with better maintenance scheduling. Inventory management issues that are creating unnecessary waste. Customer service complaints that stem from communication breakdowns between departments. Training deficiencies that are affecting safety and efficiency." I opened the folder and distributed copies of my findings. This isn't theoretical. These are specific, actionable solutions to real problems that are affecting our bottom line right now. Derek tried to interrupt, but Margaret held up her hand. "Let him finish. The investigator's report documents my interactions with employees and community members as evidence of poor judgment. I see them as evidence of engagement and leadership. A CEO who doesn't understand the concerns of his workforce is a CEO who's going to fail. I looked around the table at faces that were no longer quite as confident as they'd been an hour earlier. Grandpa Vincent didn't choose me to inherit this company because I was the most qualified person in the room. He chose me because he believed I understood what the company was supposed to represent. Not just a source of profit, but a force for good in the community. Margaret looked at Derek. "What's your response to these findings?" Derek glanced at his prepared notes, then at Patricia, then back at the folder in front of him. "We'd need time to review and verify this information." Of course. But the question before us today isn't whether Macky has identified some operational issues. The question is whether he has the judgment and character to lead this company. Uncle Thomas cleared his throat. "Margaret, we're talking about a $42 million business with over 200 employees. Character is important, but competence is essential." Agreed. And from what I'm seeing here, Macky has demonstrated both character and a willingness to learn competence. The other outside directors nodded in agreement. The vote, when it came, was 5-3 in my favor. Derek stood up abruptly. "This is a mistake. You're all making a huge mistake." "Maybe," I said, "but it's my mistake to make." 6 months later, I was sitting in Grandpa Vincent's old office, reviewing quarterly reports that showed Trenor Industries had its best financial performance in 5 years. The operational changes I'd implemented had exceeded projections. Employee satisfaction surveys showed significant improvements. Customer retention was up, and we'd opened 2 new locations. Derek had resigned 3 months earlier to start his own consulting firm. Patricia had stayed on, but transferred to a different department. Uncle Thomas remained as operations manager, and we developed a grudging mutual respect based on results rather than family politics. The investigator's report was still in my desk drawer, along with all those photographs of me helping people around town. I kept them as a reminder that sometimes what looks like weakness to others is actually your greatest strength. Grandpa Vincent had been right about one thing. Success isn't about genetics or expectations. It's about character and the willingness to keep fighting for what you believe in, even when everyone else thinks you're wrong. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.